In the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations, the date of the 12th of August marks the anniversary of a very significant event. On this day, in 2014, the very first column of the so-called humanitarian convoy travelled from Russia to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. 8 days earlier, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had submitted an official appeal to the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations, proposing to arrange an international humanitarian mission to the conflict zone. Russian Foreign Minister noted that Russia had repeatedly tried to send a humanitarian convoy via its Ministry of Emergency Situations, but each time was rejected by the Ukrainian authorities. On the 6th of August, the United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine at the initiative of Russia. The Russian permanent representative to the United Nations, the now late Vitaly Churkin, voiced the proposal to send Russian humanitarian convoys to Donetsk and Luhansk under the aegis of the ICRC. Ukraine and several Western countries, permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, did not support this proposal. Samantha Power, US permanent representative to the United Nations, said, and this is very interesting, the US will consider Russia's unilateral operation to deliver humanitarian aid to Ukraine as a direct invasion. Didier Burkhalter, then OSCE chairman, stated that humanitarian aid should be delivered with full respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Canada, on the other hand, commented that Russia is once again demonstrating its willingness to ignore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. These statements, facts and details are undeniably very important. We will need them for the purposes of comparison with another case with similar characteristics. For 9 years later, history would repeat itself, this time in Karabakh and in the form of a charade. And Western countries are now singing a completely different song to a markedly different tune. From the outset, the world has understandably suspected that Russian security forces could try to use any humanitarian pretext to supply weaponry. The European Commission, which warned Russia against any unilateral military action against Ukraine under any pretext, including humanitarian ones, tried to prevent the dispatch of humanitarian supplies. On the 5th of August, another meeting of the United Nations Security Council was held, at which Sir Mark Lyall-Grant, UK permanent representative to the United Nations, stated, "It is deeply ironic that Russia is calling an emergency meeting of the Council to discuss a humanitarian crisis of its own making." Official Kiev specified a series of terms for Russia. Ukrainian politicians insisted that the delivery of humanitarian aid should be undertaken under the aegis of the International Committee of the Red Cross and other relevant international organizations, unaccompanied by any Russian security forces. Subsequently, Kiev developed a more stringent approach, guided by exigencies predicated on the principle of sovereignty, demanding all humanitarian supplies to its eastern provinces should proceed from Ukrainian territory, under its proper control, instead of being delivered from Russia in an unchecked fashion. The Kremlin rejected these conditions and tried to break through by force, and the Ukrainian Border Customs Group, aiming to inspect the goods, was unexpectedly blocked at a Donetsk checkpoint installed by Russia. Dispatch of a convoy containing so-called humanitarian supplies without Ukraine's official consent was rightly considered across the globe as a violation of sovereignty and an act of aggression. On the 22nd of August 2014, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen condemned the entry of a Russian so-called humanitarian convoy into Ukrainian territory without Kiev's consent, accusing Russia of a blatant breach of its international commitments. France too joined the group, with then President François Hollande expressing his concerns in a telephone conversation with President Vladimir Putin regarding the unilateral Russian mission carried out under the auspices of an alleged humanitarian effort. The former French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius suggested that under the guise of an innocuous convoy, Russia might be trying to establish a base near Donetsk and Luhansk. This very issue was also the subject of a special investigation at the United Nations Security Council. On the 8th of September 2014, in a statement to the OSCE Permanent Council's special session on Ukraine, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights Ivan Simonovich declared that local armed groups in charge of Ukraine's eastern regions openly refused any aid from the Ukrainian government, adding, on the other hand, the well-publicized white truck convoy that was sent over the border by the Russian Federation without the consent of the Ukrainian government was able to deliver its cargo. The well-being of the residents of the Luhansk has obviously become part of a larger geopolitical struggle. This is both a violation of humanitarian principles as well as humanitarian law. The West's unshakably consolidated position on the subject has remained intact throughout the succeeding time period. For instance, in a note delivered to the OSCE Permanent Council based in Vienna, US Ambassador Daniel Baer reiterated the same argument, lambasting the efforts of Russian-supported separatists in blocking international aid convoys from the rest of Ukraine and declaring their decision to accept so-called humanitarian shipments from the Russian Federation as being inconsistent with international law and in violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. The important point of the whole story is not about what was sent to Donetsk and Luhansk, although the military achievements of the separatists became more noticeable after delivery of this so-called humanitarian aid, but the very fact of the disregard for Ukraine's sovereignty under the guise of a humanitarian disaster. Another curious aspect is that during the entire summer of 2014, Kiev offered to dispatch the same humanitarian aid convoys to rebellious Donetsk and Luhansk, with international organizations, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, being actively involved in terms of offering assistance. Rather unsurprisingly, the pro-Kremlin separatists who seized power in this region rejected this assistance, saying that they would accept humanitarian aid not from the West, but from the East. In other words, from Russia. Doesn't it sound familiar to you? Does it ring a bell? The focal point of this entire story is the unconditional support of Western countries for Ukraine's fair position, its sovereignty, and efforts to curb the secessionist tendencies in the rebellious eastern regions inspired by Russia. Ukraine despised, and rightly so, the idea of a land passage uncontrolled by itself, connecting Russia with the separatist regions. Naturally, Kiev retained the West's firm and unwavering backing. At the time, these self-same Western nations urged the regional authorities to accept assistance from the central government of Ukraine instead of Russia. No one pressurized Kiev to open the road to allow the uncontrolled crossings from the Russian border that were unhindered and unimpeded. On the contrary, Moscow was criticized for its blatant support of the secessionist forces, being accused of infringing Ukraine's territorial integrity and counteracting Kiev's integration policies. It's always possible to suggest that one should not fall into the trap of generalization, and each single case, however similar they may appear to be, could be different. There's always room for maneuver. Nevertheless, that which took place 9 long years ago in eastern Ukraine is not that different to what is happening now regarding Karabakh. One can't help but discern the factual similarities. Armenia is now playing the proxy role of Russia, sending trucks containing dubious humanitarian cargoes to the Azerbaijani region, as if to its own homeland, without any coordination with Baku, and the role of Ukraine is being played by Azerbaijan. So, where does the difference lie? In view of the similarities when it comes to the facts on the ground and the applicable legal norms and principles, one wonders why the Western evaluation of these two cases differs so violently. Azerbaijan is ready, as Ukraine was 9 years ago, to let foreign convoys into its territory, albeit solely by the route which, in Baku's considered opinion, is most judicious. If the actual purpose is to ease the humanitarian predicament of the Armenians in the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, then the question is as to why supplies should not be transported by the routes that Baku considers safe and right. Azerbaijan needs to control aid destined for its sovereign territory and ensure that all customs procedures are followed. So does Ukraine. The point here is that Kiev is understood and espoused in the West, whereas Baku is not. The comparison makes one wonder. There appears to be a great deal of hypocrisy propped up with mental gymnastics, and Azerbaijan is acutely conscious of this. Double standards may sound trite and unseemly, But terminology is probably apt here. Azerbaijan does not like to be patronized. It understands only too well that fairness is an illusion and a very relative concept. Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan exclave has been under blockade for the past 30 years, and contrary to Article 9 of the 10 November 2020 tripartite statement obligating Armenia to provide an overland passage to the area, Yerevan has so far done nothing to honour this provision. No concerns have been raised about this either. In what is falsely presented to be a humanitarian disaster in Karabakh by the government of Armenia and some supportive Western powers and organizations, Baku discerns the unmistakable signs of a tasteless and burlesque charade. Azerbaijan does not feel encumbered by the weight of the admonitions levied against it. It feels on the right side of history and justly righteous.